Okay, ready to dive into some seriously deep waters. Today, we're tackling Friedrich Schleiermacher.
Maybe not a household name like, your Kants and your Hegels.
Definitely not a Kant or Hegel.
Yeah.
But trust me, this guy, Schleiermacher,
Yeah.
total philosophical powerhouse.
Oh, yeah, no question. Huge influence, especially in hermeneutics and translation theory. Stuff we wrestle with even now.
And we've got some heavy-duty source material to guide us. Excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. We're going deep.
Stanford Encyclopedia. Oh, we're not messing around. This is serious philosophical territory.
So get ready to unpack some dense concepts, language, interpretation. Even art and religion get tangled up in Schleiermacher's world.
And how all that connects to even bigger questions, right? Like, what does it even mean to understand something or someone? What is meaning, really? Heavy stuff.
Exactly. So first things first. Stanford Encyclopedia doesn't just feature anyone. Why Schleiermacher? What makes him worthy of this kind of deep philosophical analysis?
Well, one thing is he was building on giants, really indebted to thinkers like Herder,
But there's always a but with these big thinkers, right?
Right. He takes those ideas and adds his own twist. A whole other layer of complexity. That's what makes him fascinating.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example of those twists. Where does Schleiermacher really diverge? Where's that Schleiermacher stamp?
Well, his philosophy of language is a good place to start. Like Herder, he was convinced that thought and language are like deeply intertwined, but
But he takes it further.
way further. Schleiermacher actually claims thought-is language. Identical, he even calls it inner language. Like that's how we think, even when we're not speaking out loud.
Hold on, thought-is language. That's a bold statement, even for a philosopher.
It is, and it sparked tons of debate. I mean, if you take it literally, no language, no thought. What about when I'm like visualizing something? No words involved.
Right, like picturing a shape, a geometric pattern. That's thought, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Schleiermacher knew about these cases where thought seems to happen without, outward language. That's where inner language comes in.
So inner language is the language of thought. But if it's still language, does that mean there's no room for purely mental concepts? Unspoken thought.
You're hitting on the tricky parts. This gets to Schleiermacher's whole philosophy of mind, which is really complex. How do we represent the world internally? How's that connected to language and to reality itself?
It's not just about words then. It's the mental stuff behind them.
Exactly. And for Schleiermacher, meaning isn't just about things out there. It's also about how we use language to grapple with those things. He was big on what's called semantic holism.
Semantic holism.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
let's unpack that. Sounds a little intimidating.
It can be, but basically it means a word's meaning isn't fixed, like in a dictionary. It's connected to all the other words, the whole system of language, like a web of meaning.
Each word's part of this giant network then.
Exactly. To really get a word, you got to get its relationships to all the others. Think of freedom. Political freedom, personal freedom, artistic freedom.
Yeah,
Totally different, right?
because they're connected to different concepts, different ideas.
Exactly. Each one's tied to a whole constellation of meanings.
This is making me think about language in a whole new way. And this idea of interconnectedness, it keeps popping up with Schleiermacher, right?
Oh, you're picking up on a theme here. It's all over his work. Even in his philosophy of mind and body, he was all about the unity of mind and body, called it life, and totally rejected any attempts to reduce one to the other.
So, no mind-body dualism for Schleiermacher.
Nope. They're inseparable, two sides of the same coin, like you said. What's really wild is that he went so far as to say the soul, or the mind, is force.
Force. Like a physical force. Now I'm lost.
I know, right? It sounds strange at first, but what he meant was the mind isn't this passive, airy-fairy thing. It's active, dynamic, always interacting with the world, shaping things, being shaped.
It's like our minds are always pushing and pulling, changing how we see things and how we act.
Exactly. And this whole mind is force idea, it has huge implications. How we understand free will, motivation, even consciousness itself. It's like our minds are part of nature, not separate from it.
Wow. Starting to see how all these pieces of Schleiermacher's thought are fitting together. But we can't talk about him without talking about hermeneutics, right? I mean, that's his big contribution.
Oh, absolutely. Everything we've talked about so far, language, mind, it all feeds into his groundbreaking work on hermeneutics, the art and theory of interpretation.
All right, lay it on me. What were Schleiermacher's big insights? How did he change the game when it comes to understanding stuff?
Well, for Schleiermacher, understanding isn't just something that passively happens. He actually said misunderstanding is the default state, the starting point. To really understand, you got to put in the work, engage in this rigorous process of interpretation.
Wait, so we're more likely to misunderstand than understand? That's kind of unsettling.
It can be, but it's crucial to his whole approach. And the reason he thought this is because there are these deep, deep differences between people, even within the same culture. Linguistic differences, conceptual differences. It's complicated.
So even when we think we're speaking the same language, there's tons of room for miscommunication.
Tons. And that's exactly why we need a good framework for interpretation. That's what Schleiermacher was trying to build.
All right, I'm hooked.
Yeah.
How did he approach this whole interpretation thing? What are the key elements?
So he said there are two sides to it, linguistic and psychological. The linguistic side is all about the words themselves. Grammar, syntax, the historical context, all that stuff. But we also got to go deeper, try to get into the author's head.
So it's not just decoding the words, it's getting into the author's mind.
Exactly. Trying to reconstruct their thought process, figure out what they were trying to get across. He even talks about a divinatory method where the interpreter's making educated guesses, trying to get a feel for the author's mindset.
It's like being a detective, trying to piece together clues to figure out the criminal's motive.
I like that. And Schleiermacher said this divination isn't about projecting your own ideas onto the text. It's about using all the evidence you can find, historical context, the author's other works, biographical details to build a whole picture.
This is fascinating, but I can already hear our listeners thinking, how can we ever really understand someone else's thoughts, especially someone from a completely different time and culture? Didn't Schleiermacher himself acknowledge that there are limits to interpretation?
He did, and that's what makes his theory so nuanced and interesting. He knew that complete understanding might be impossible, but he didn't think that meant we should just give up. Interpretation, for him, was an ongoing process, always striving for greater insight, and that makes it, intellectually rewarding.
It's not about finding one right answer, then. It's about this constant back and forth, always refining our understanding.
You got it. And this brings us to another big piece of Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, the circularity of interpretation. He realized that understanding a text is kind of like a spiral. Your understanding of the parts changes how you see the whole, and vice versa.
You're always circling back, getting new insights each time.
Precisely. And this shows just how much rigor Schleiermacher demanded from interpreters. It's not just passively soaking up information. You're actively engaging with the text, challenging your assumptions, constantly refining your understanding.
Man, Schleiermacher's hermeneutics is a lot more complex and demanding than I ever realized. But I can see how it can also be incredibly rewarding. It's like you can get so much more out of a text and out of understanding the person who created it if you approach it this way.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, the intellectual rigor, the hard work, but also the pursuit of meaning, the deeper understanding. And that's what makes his hermeneutics so influential, even now, centuries later.
We've covered a lot. Schleiermacher's ideas about language, mind, and interpretation. It's all pretty revolutionary stuff. But his influence doesn't stop there, right? Translation, aesthetics, even politics and religion. He had something to say about everything.
Oh yeah, he didn't shy away from the big questions. And what's amazing is how relevant his insights still are.
Can't wait to dive into all that. But for now, I think we need a break to let all this sink in.
Schleiermacher's work on translation. Perfect example of how his ideas about language, and interpretation play out in a practical way.
Yeah, let's talk translation. I gotta admit, for someone so into the complexities of language, I'm curious how Schleiermacher even approached translation. It seems like with all those nuances, it'd be impossible.
He definitely didn't see it as simple, more of an art form, really, than just like swapping words around.
So not just finding the dictionary equivalent in another language, more to it than that.
Way more. Remember, for Schleiermacher, languages aren't just saying the same things differently. They're whole different systems, different ways of thinking and seeing the world. He even used the term conceptual gulf.
A conceptual gulf. That sounds pretty daunting for a translator. How do you even bridge that gap without losing, the essence of what's being said?
That's the challenge, right? And Schleiermacher thought that trying to force the original text into the mold of the new language, it just ends up distorting the meaning. The closer you stick to the original words, the further you might get from the real point.
It's a catch-22 then, almost.
Yeah, kind of. So what did Schleiermacher propose? Well, his solution was pretty radical. He said, instead of making the original text fit the new language, you should actually bend the new language to reflect the original's way of thinking.
Bend the language. That sounds like it could get messy.
It can. Schleiermacher knew this would make translations sound, well, a little weird, maybe clunky, even jarring. But he saw it as a trade-off.
So a little awkwardness is okay as long as you're preserving the integrity of the original.
Exactly. He thought that awkwardness, that feeling of something foreign, it actually serves a purpose. It reminds you, the reader, that you're dealing with a whole different way of thinking. And that's more enriching than just, smoothing everything over to sound familiar.
I get it. It's like when you travel to a new country and everything's so different, it can be unsettling, but it also opens up your mind to new possibilities.
Perfect analogy. For Schleiermacher, translation was kind of like that travel experience. It's about encountering different ways of seeing things.
But even with all this bending, is there still stuff that gets lost in translation? Some things that just can't be moved over?
Oh, for sure. Even Schleiermacher, with his radical approach, knew that translation has limits, especially when it comes to what he called the holistic aspects of meaning. Those are just untranslatable.
When you say holistic, you mean like those unspoken assumptions, culturally specific stuff that's so ingrained you don't even realize it's there.
Exactly. Those shades of meaning, those connotations, they're tied to a whole way of life, a culture. Super hard to capture in another language.
So even with the best efforts, some things are just going to get left behind.
Yeah, sadly. Schleiermacher didn't see it as a failure, though, more like an inherent limit. You're always striving for the best possible version, but knowing perfect equivalence might be impossible.
It really highlights how complex language is, doesn't it? How much can get lost when we try to communicate, even in everyday life.
Absolutely. But despite all that, Schleiermacher still believed in the power of translation. He saw it as this vital tool, bridging cultures, broadening horizons, helping people from different backgrounds understand each other.
So even if perfect translation can't happen, the act of trying is still valuable.
Totally. It makes us confront our own assumptions about language, about meaning. It's a good exercise, even if we don't always succeed.
Schleiermacher on translation. It brings together so much of his philosophy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Language, interpretation, even mind and body, it all connects.
Right. And it's really cool to see how all that feeds into his ideas about aesthetics, too. Like, he was really interested in whether non-linguistic art forms, like music or sculpture, could actually express meaning.
That's where things get really interesting, especially with this whole thought IS language thing. If that's true, how can art that doesn't use words have any meaning at all?
It's a puzzle Schleiermacher grappled with for a while. At first, he was reluctant to say non-linguistic art could have meaning, maybe because it didn't fit with his ideas about language. But he eventually had to change his mind.
A change of heart. What made him rethink things?
Well, he couldn't ignore the fact that art, like sculpture, painting, they clearly convey meaning, even without words. Think about those ancient Greek sculptures. So much religious and mythological meaning packed into them, even though they might not have had, written explanations back then.
It's true. You can feel the power of those sculptures, even if you don't know the specific stories behind them.
Exactly. Schleiermacher had to admit that language isn't the only way to communicate meaning. But it was tricky for him reconciling that with his earlier ideas.
So how did he explain how non-linguistic art could have meaning? Did he have to completely abandon his old views?
He actually offered two explanations, which are kind of contradictory, to be honest. One was that maybe these art forms are expressing meanings that haven't been put into words yet, like thought might exist beyond language, at least sometimes.
That's a pretty big shift.
Yeah.
It opens up the possibility that there are ways of thinking and expressing meaning that go beyond what we can say.
Right. It's a radical idea. But then he also said, maybe non-linguistic art gets its meaning from the artist, who did deconceive of it linguistically first.
So language is still the source, even if the final product isn't words.
Yeah, it's like the artist is translating a thought from their head, from language, into a different form. Music, sculpture, whatever.
It's fascinating how Schleiermacher wrestled with these two ideas, even though they don't totally fit together. It shows how seriously he took this stuff, always pushing himself, even if it meant facing some intellectual contradictions.
I agree that honesty is one of the things that makes him so interesting. He didn't try to simplify things or avoid tough questions. He was okay with complexity and ambiguity, and he knew sometimes there aren't easy answers.
All right, from language and interpretation to translation, and now even aesthetics. Schleiermacher covered a lot of ground. But there's one more piece I want to explore, and that's his concept of dialectics.
Dialectics were huge for Schleiermacher. He saw it as this art of pure thought, this pursuit of truth and coherence, and ultimately universal agreement.
Universal agreement, that's a tall order. especially given how much he emphasized the diversity of thought and language. How did he square those two things?
That's the challenge at the core of his dialectics, I think. He knew how hard it is to really understand each other, especially across different cultures and languages, but he still believed it was possible to find some common ground. He thought that through real dialogue, through actually engaging with different perspectives and being open to learning from other languages and cultures, we could get closer to that ideal of shared understanding.
It's like he's taking his ideas about translation and applying them to philosophy itself.
Exactly. That back and forth, that movement between different languages and ways of thinking, that's how we build a shared space where meaningful conversation can happen.
But didn't Schleiermacher also say there are limits to translation? How does that fit with this vision of universal agreement?
That's the tension, the productive friction that drives his dialectics. He understood that perfect understanding might be impossible, but that didn't mean we should stop trying. The journey, the process of working towards understanding was just as important as the end goal.
It's an inspiring vision, but also kind of intimidating. You need a lot of humility to really engage in that kind of dialogue, to truly listen and respect other people's views.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what makes Schleiermacher's philosophy so relevant even now. We live in a world that's so divided, and his emphasis on dialogue, understanding, finding common ground, it's a powerful message, a reminder that we don't have to give in to those forces of division.
All right, we've covered so much of Schleiermacher's thought already. Language, interpretation, translation, aesthetics, even a bit of his dialectics. But there's still more to uncover. Ethics, his political and social ideas, and of course his philosophy of religion.
You're right, there's so much more, and just as profound and thought-provoking as everything we've talked about so far.
I'm excited to dive into all that. Schleiermacher's philosophical universe is vast and complex, but also incredibly rewarding to explore. Let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, and then we'll plunge into the final frontier of Schleiermacher's thought. Okay, back for the final stretch of our Schleiermacher deep dive. We've been through a lot, his ideas about language, all that hermeneutic stuff, translation, even art.
And now, what might seem like a whole different ballgame. Ethics, politics, his views on society, and of course his philosophy of religion. Big stuff.
It does seem like a jump, but I have a feeling we'll find some familiar threads here, those connections, those themes that run through all of Schleiermacher's work.
Oh, definitely. His system is remarkably coherent, even across different areas. Like his ethics, they have that same tension we saw in his other ideas, that push and pull.
Okay, I'm curious. Talk to me about that tension in Schleiermacher's ethics. What are the main driving forces behind his ideas about morality?
One big one is this interplay between being unique, individual distinctiveness, and at the same time being part of something bigger, universal humanity. Schleiermacher didn't buy into Kant's whole thing about a single moral rule for everyone. He was more interested in how diverse ethical systems are, how different people and cultures think about right and wrong.
So no one-size-fits-all morality for Schleiermacher.
Nope. He believed in what you might call a pluralist cosmopolitanism, embracing ethical diversity while still holding on to some shared human values.
Pluralist cosmopolitanism. Try saying that 3 times fast. What does it actually mean, though?
Basically, it means recognizing that there are tons of different ethical viewpoints out there, different cultures, different societies. They all have their own ways of doing things morally. But at the same time, there's some basic common ground, a shared humanity that connects us all.
Sounds like a pretty radical idea, especially for his time. Almost like he's anticipating the debates we're having now about multiculturalism, tolerance, and finding those universal values in a world that's increasingly diverse.
You're right. Schleiermacher was ahead of the curve on a lot of things. He got that different people, different cultures have different moral compasses, and he saw that as a good thing, a way to enrich our understanding of what it means to be human.
But doesn't that create problems? What happens when those different moral compasses clash? Like, what if a specific culture's ethics conflict with that idea of universal humanity? How do we deal with that?
Tough question. Schleiermacher knew there would always be tension between the specific and the universal. The individual, or group's values, versus those big overarching values that go beyond any one group. He thought we should respect different ethical systems, but not if they violate basic human dignity, the worth of every person.
A delicate balancing act, then. Respecting differences while also upholding some kind of universal standard for how we treat each other. Sounds familiar, right? Still struggling with that today.
For sure. And that same tension shows up in Schleiermacher's political and social ideas, too. He was big on individual freedom, limited government, keeping church and state separate.
Sounds pretty familiar. Core ideas for modern democracies. But back then, that was pretty progressive stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. He was going against the grain. A big advocate for individual rights. He argued for Jewish emancipation in Prussia, more rights for women, and his views on education, especially universities, super forward-thinking. He saw them as places to nurture both knowledge and individuality.
Sounds like he really believed in the power of education to make a better world, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
He did. He thought education was key for critical thinking, social progress, making the world more just and compassionate. And for Schleiermacher, all of that tied back to how he understood religion.
Okay, let's get into that. Schleiermacher's philosophy of religion. He famously said religion is all about intuition and feeling, not reason, not dogma. That's a pretty bold statement. What did he mean by that?
It's a definition that's caused a lot of head scratching over the years. I think he was trying to get at the core of religious experience, that feeling of awe, wonder, being connected to something bigger than yourself. He thought that was something deeply personal, intuitive, not something you could figure out just by thinking about it or following a set of rules.
It's definitely different from how we often talk about religion now. All the debates about specific beliefs, doctrines. Schleiermacher seems to be saying something much deeper.
Right. He was going for a vision of religion that was intellectually serious, but also deeply personal, something that felt true to human experience, something that went beyond just words and logic.
It makes me think of his idea about the mind being force, that dynamic energy always interacting with the world. It's like he's saying religious experience is kind of like that, a force that moves us, shapes us, connects us to something larger.
Wow, great connection. He saw both the mind and religious experience as rooted in feeling, that realm of intuition and emotion that's hard to put into words.
But this emphasis on feeling, intuition, it seems to contrast with his very rigorous analytical approach to language interpretation, all that. Was he trying to say religion gets a free pass? That it's somehow immune to critical analysis?
That's a question scholars are still debating. He definitely believed in reason, but he also saw its limits, especially when talking about the spiritual, the divine. He thought religious experience had to be felt, not just dissected and explained.
So finding a balance then, the mind, the heart, both have a role to play in how we understand religion.
Exactly, and that's what makes his take on religion so interesting. He embraced those complexities, those contradictions that faith often brings up, and he offered a way to think about religion that speaks to a lot of people, even those who don't consider themselves traditionally religious.
You're right, it's a broader view. Schleiermacher was a Christian theologian, but his definition of religion seems to go beyond any one religion, any specific set of beliefs.
That's one of the things that makes his work so relevant today. More and more people are moving away from organized religion, but Schleiermacher's focus on the experience of the divine, that feeling of connection to something larger, that resonates, it speaks to a human need, regardless of what you call it.
So even if we don't have a specific faith, a set of doctrines we follow, we can still tap into that essence of religious experience that Schleiermacher is talking about.
Absolutely. He was getting at something fundamental about what it means to be human. That need for meaning, for purpose, for connection, that goes beyond any culture or religion.
Wow, what a journey this deep dive has been. It's clear Schleiermacher's ideas are still so relevant today. He makes us question our assumptions about language, knowledge, ethics, even what religion is really about.
He was a true visionary, a philosopher who wasn't afraid to tackle the big questions. He pushed the boundaries of thought and offered new ways to understand ourselves and the world.
And he reminds us that the pursuit of understanding, whether it's through language, interpretation, even religious experience, it's a journey, an ongoing process. And it takes both a sharp mind, and an open heart.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And Schleiermacher, I think you'd agree with that. The goal isn't just to collect knowledge, it's to cultivate a deeper understanding of ourselves and this crazy universe we're all part of.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of Friedrich Schleiermacher. Hopefully it sparked your curiosity, made you think a little differently. Keep asking those big questions and keep searching for that deeper understanding. Until next time.